Welcome, everyone. We'd like to thank you for joining us today for our webinar on measuring racial equity in the food system, established and suggested metrics. Today's webinar is being offered by the Racial Equity in the Food Systems Workgroup, and you'll hear a little bit about us in partnership with MSU's Center for Regional Food Systems. To get us started, today I want to introduce you to Rich Pirog, who is the director of the center, and he'll help us get started.
Thank you very much, Renee, and welcome everybody to this national webinar. Really glad to have you all here. Before we get started with our presentation, we want to talk about the primary sponsor, which is the Racial Equity in the Food System Workgroup. You're looking at a slide here that has the members of the committee. This workgroup is a community of cooperative extension professionals and community stakeholders from government, from nonprofits, from all kinds of institutions that work in food and health, people who connect, learn, and collaborate to facilitate change within our institutions and society to build racial equity within the food system. This is our, I think, fourth webinar that we've done in the last year and a half. We're really glad that we've had such a strong interest in these national webinars on racial equity in the food system. Before we introduce our first presenter and co-author of the publication, that is the title of this webinar, we're going to do a very quick poll. And I will start the poll question now. There's only one question. It has three possible responses. Please go ahead and respond to this poll. Okay, we'll give you 10 more seconds to respond to the poll. I think we've got most of our responses. Let's go a few more seconds. Looks like we're all there. For those just coming on, we're taking a quick poll question before we start our first presentation. And we will go ahead and end the poll now. And I believe you're looking, I'm going to share the results with you. What we found here is that about 60% of you that responded say you're interested in racial equity metrics in your own work, but you haven't yet actually incorporated them in your work. About a quarter of you say you're already using some type of metrics, and about 15% are uncertain. And it's probably part of the reason why you're on this webinar. You want to learn more information and see if this might be about this topic and see if it might be a fit. So thank you very much for those for taking that question, and we're going to move on to our presentation and our first speaker. I'm going to stop sharing.
Go ahead and close that window.
Oh, it should end. Okay, we'll get that out of their screen here in just a second. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker and the main presenter for today, Kathryn Colasanti. And I'm really pleased to introduce Kathryn. She is the co-author of this publication, Measuring Racial Equity in the Food System, which came out in May of this year. The format here is that Kathryn's going to give a quick overview of this report, and then we have two respondents. And Renee Wallace, our moderator, is going to introduce those two respondents directly after Kathryn makes her comments. We're going to save all questions until after the respondents. So please do use the Q&A and type questions as you get them. You don't need to wait, and we're going to curate those questions after Kathryn speaks and our two respondents speak. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Kathryn Colasanti. She's a specialist at the center. Kathryn is the architect of the Michigan Good Food Charter, a set of goals and agenda priorities around food that's healthy, fair, affordable, and green. And she also leads the center's shared measurement work around the charter, which is one of the reasons why this project on measuring racial equity in the food system happened. So Kathryn, take it away.
Great, thank you, Rich, and thanks everyone for joining. So thrilled to have so many of you here with us today. So as Rich said, I want to give you an overview of this new publication. It came out just about 2 months ago. Before I launch into the content, I just want to spend some time on the context, so you have a sense of how and why this came to be. So the process of developing this was fairly straightforward, and my co-author, Sarah Rubman Alvarez, who's on the webinar with us here today and available to answer questions. Sarah led the process of reviewing more than 100 reports and peer-reviewed articles on race or ethnicity in the food system, as well as interviewing about a dozen experts in this area, including Joann, who you'll hear from shortly. And as a result of that process, we came up with the 86 potential metrics in this scan. It's not every possible metric in the whole world that relates to race and food. We've already heard suggestions for other metrics, which is great. We've also already been asked if we plan to do an update. And my answer to that is I think an update would be valuable if the landscape of available secondary data or data collection tools changes substantially. But really the goal is not to have a completely exhaustive list of every possible metric in the space that anybody could think of, because that would really be nearly endless. Nor is the goal to say that these are absolutely the very best metrics that everybody should use, because really that's very situational depending on the nature of your work and the dynamics in your community. And I'm certainly not recommending that anyone track all 86 of these metrics. I think that would be overwhelming. So really the goal is to provide a foundation for a conversation that you can have with your partners and colleagues about what metrics in racial equity in the food system could make sense for you. And so what we really tried to do is lift up the metrics that we have seen other organizations using, and metrics that people who have spent time thinking about racial equity metrics in this space suggest would be valuable. So just to further illustrate how this resource could be used, I want to share the context for this work here in Michigan. Rich mentioned the Michigan Good Food Charter. So in Michigan, we have a charter which articulates a vision and a set of goals for the food system here in our state that was based on a grassroots process of engaging hundreds of people from across sectors and regions and demographics. And a big part of our work at the Center for Regional Food Systems is coordinating networks of people to help advance the goals of the charter and to measure progress towards the goals. And that latter part is done through the Shared Measurement Advisory Committee, which I coordinate. The charter was established in 2010 with a 10-year vision through 2020. So now that we're in 2019, we're starting the process of moving towards a new iteration of a next charter, which will take us beyond 2020. And as part of that process, we are looking to identify focus areas in the food system and then specific metrics related to each focus area. And the one thing we know about the next iteration of the charter, because it's what our partners and stakeholders have been saying and asking for the last year or so, is that it will have a much stronger focus on equity and racial equity in particular. So as we transition, to the next charter, we will be identifying at least one racial equity metric for each focus area in this new iteration of the charter, as well as establishing food system racial equity as its own focus area. And so we'll be using this metrics publication to have those conversations. So that's the reason that we developed this publication. We know we want to hold ourselves accountable for a more equitable food system in the next iteration of our charter. To do that, we know we need ways to measure change and to measure progress. So we started asking ourselves, well, what have other people done to measure equity in the food system? And to answer that, we produced this scan. And then the other piece that we are really excited about is we have, just starting with us here this week, a postdoc in food sovereignty and racial equity, Kim Carr, who in her position will have the opportunity to build on the metric scan that I'm sharing with you here today and look at some of the equities in Michigan's food system. So the point I'm trying to make with all of this background and context is the publication is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And what will make it more than just paper that sits on a shelf is having a group and a process in place to think through what areas of focus are most important and how metrics can be aligned with a set of goals that will motivate action. So it's not just data for the sake of data. And speaking of data without a strategy or purpose behind it, I want to share these notes of caution that we included on page 6 of the publication. Measurement, as you guys probably all know, is hard in general, but there are some additional challenges in the racial equity space that I think we should be mindful of. I think if we're not careful, we can actually do more harm than good. First, racism is real, but race is a social construct, right? So there are no inherent or biological differences between races. So when we see differences between races, we're seeing the results of current and historical injustices. So what we don't want to do is inadvertently reinforce unfounded perceptions of differences between races by pointing out different outcomes, right? So we need to take it back to structural underpinnings. People are more than their race, right? All of us have multiple identities. Race is just one of them. We don't want these metrics to be used to make blanket decisions for entire races of people. Third note of caution, isolated data points are not the whole story, right? Any metrics data should be presented in the context of how an issue is experienced in people's lives, as well as the larger structure, sociocultural dynamics at play. And then finally, research can be a distraction from taking steps towards change. So we already know that racism is an issue. We don't need to prove that point further. So what we want to do is use research and measurement when it's part of a path towards positive change and not as a stalling tactic. So moving now from the preamble, I wanted to share this sample page with you just to demonstrate how this scan is set up. So in black there at the top of the table, food and farm business, that denotes the overall theme. There are 4 themes in the publication, and then the green text at the top of the table is the sub-theme. And then you see several different columns. So all of the metrics are numbered. Then we have, of course, the name of the metric itself. The next column is a little bit further description about that metric, or its purpose. The example, where available, we pulled from a report or a publication, sometimes a journal article, just demonstrating how that statistic or metric was used, putting it into context. The next column over, you have your scale and granularity. So at what scale was the data collected? And in this top row, in this example, metric 35, the data was collected at the national level for the United States. And then granularity tells us if it can be disaggregated, so broken down to look at by smaller geographic units at all. So for this example, we can look at that particular metric at the state level, but only for the 25 states with the largest agricultural cash receipts. The unit of analysis is who or what the data was collected about. And then data type is the next column, and we have 4 different data types that we talk about in this scan. Secondary data is essentially where you can go and just look up the number, right? So it's already, data already exists, you can go look it up. The next is analysis based on secondary data, and that's where you can go look up a number but have to do some further calculations in order to get to the metric that is being described. So sometimes it's combining multiple data sets or just doing some other analysis. The third type is primary data, and that is where an organization has collected the data before and there's a tool that has been developed. But in order to have that metric for your community, you would have to go out and collect new data based on that tool or using that tool. And then the fourth type is suggested. And that, to our knowledge, is data that has not been previously collected or The metric has not been fully operationalized or defined yet, but something that, again, in our interviews, the people that we talked to thought would be valuable to look at. And then the final column is data source or methodology, so describing how the data was collected, and if it is secondary data, what is the agency or the unit that maintains that database and where you could find it. So again, just overview of the type of information for each of the metrics. And then I'll just kind of briefly go through a few examples. Obviously, nobody wants me to go through all 86. But I'll just share one per theme. So first theme is food access, with sub-themes of food security and hunger, food at schools and early childhood education sites, the community food environment, and food education. So one example, and the second orange box there is metric 10, the percentage of schools participating in the National School Lunch Program, offering fresh fruits and vegetables by the predominant race of students. So this one is primary data. So there's an organization that has collected this before, but is not, to our knowledge, doing so any longer. But their survey tool could be utilized to collect that information again. The next theme is food and farm business, with sub-themes of ownership and business support. So the first orange box is metric 36, looking at farm ownership by race. And this is secondary data that's available by state and county, as long as there are enough respondents, so enough farms that responded to the survey question. And it's from the USDA Census of Agriculture, which is conducted every 5 years, and most recently in 2017. So that data was actually recently released from that most recent Census of Ag. The third theme is food chain labor. And sub-themes here include income and benefits, upward mobility, and labor protection. One example metric is number 65. The percentage of people, this is second orange box on your screen, the percentage of people who are CEOs in food industries by race. This was an analysis based on secondary data. So it comes from data in the American Community Survey on wage and salary workers. And one just compelling quote from a Food Chain Workers Alliance report to illustrate this metric: more than 72% of the chief executive officers in food industries were white men. Fewer than 15% were white women. Latino men composed 5% of CEOs. Black men and Latino females comprised less than 2%. And then finally, the fourth theme is food movement organizations. And here we're talking about organizations whose focus is explicitly to change or improve the food system. You could consider mission-driven businesses as part of the food movement in that sense, but in this report, we focused on nonprofits, other organizations outside of the food supply chain. So no sub-themes here, but a few example metrics on the screen, and the one I want to mention is number 85, looking at the amount of funding attracted by food movement organizations by race of leadership. And this one's an example of a suggested metric, as are many of the metrics in this particular theme, actually, meaning it hasn't been fully operationalized. But the idea here is to measure equity and access to funding among food movement organizations. So who has resources, who's getting the resources to do this kind of work? So I will conclude there. That's just a few examples, and our next respondents will highlight some other examples. But before closing, I just want to be sure to acknowledge my co-author, Sarah Rodman Alvarez. Again, she's with us here and can help answer questions. All of the interviewees and researchers whose work that we drew on for this publication. Also the members of the Shared Measurement Advisory Committee for reviewing and contributing to earlier drafts, and then funding from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to Renee.
Yeah, thank you, Kathryn. That was an excellent introduction to us with this amazing tool. And so as we dive into it, I'm sure we're going to learn a lot more, but that got us started. I just want to remind everyone, you can enter questions in the Q&A, and those will be answered after our next two respondents. And you will also receive a recording as well as the materials for the webinar post-event. So you'll look forward to getting that next. I'd like to introduce our first respondent. We'll have two respondents that will talk with us today. Our first respondent is Joann Lowe. And Joann Lowe is a co-director of Food Chain Workers Alliance. And she's been with the organization for almost all of its 10 years. And it's celebrating this month. Congratulations, Joann. Joann is a member of the Leadership Circle and the Board of Directors of the Los Angeles Food Policy Council, and also a member of the Board of Directors of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. She's been organizing in the labor movement for over 20 minutes. So we're going to hear, for 20 years. Did I say 20 minutes?
That's short.
Her career is longer. Her career is longer than that. Thank you. Well, we have to have a little humanity here, right?
Yes, sure.
So we'll hear a bit from Joann, and when she's finished, I'll also introduce our second respondent. Thank you, Joann.
Great, thank you. I want to thank the Racial Equity in the Food Systems Workgroup and the MSU Center for Regional Food Systems for inviting me to speak today, and also for including the racial equity metrics that we at the Food Chain Workers Alliance have used. And as part of our work, we do some of our own research and produce reports. And as mentioned, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, and this month specifically. And we are a binational coalition of unions, worker centers, and workers' rights advocacy organizations. We now have 32 member organizations representing over 370,000 workers all throughout the food system in the US and Canada. And one of our founding values of the Food Chain Workers Alliance is racial justice. And so that has been core to who we are as an organization and how we work together. And so the vast majority of the workers represented by our member groups are workers of color. Our staff is majority color, and our leadership is also majority people of color. You can go to the next slide. So just tell you a little bit about who food workers are. There are 21.5 million people in the United States who work in the food system. So that's the largest sector of employment. And at the same time, though, it's the lowest paid. And so this is from our report, No Piece of the Pie, that we released in 2016. You can see food chain workers earn a median wage of $10 per hour, lower than all other sectors. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay. So as you all know, the food system in the United States and in many other countries was built on the backs of slaves, and the historical legacy of slavery and institutional racism continues to have an impact today, particularly on food workers. So in our first comprehensive report on food workers in the US, it's called The Hands That Feed Us in 2012, our members surveyed close to 700 workers around the country, and we found that workers of color, unsurprisingly, were paid less than the minimum wage at higher rates than white workers, and more white workers in the food system were earning a living wage than workers of color. And in our second report, No Piece of the Pie, which we produced, we researched with the support from the Solidarity Research Cooperative. We looked at government data, as shown in this slide. And so you can see that workers of color, particularly women workers of color in the food system, earn significantly less than white males. And so these types of metrics that look at racial equity or racial inequity for food workers helps inform us where we're going to focus our support for worker organizing, as well as for policies that we advocate for. And it provides data that can support these organizing and policy campaigns. And so knowing how little food workers are paid, particularly food workers of color, we have focused a lot of our efforts around supporting raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour and to eliminate the sub-minimum wage for tip workers, which also disproportionately negatively impacts workers of color and women workers. And we also know that workers of color fare a lot better when they're organized or when they're in a union. And so we've looked at data, for example, in a report on the food retail industry in California that we produced with the Food Labor Research Center at UC Berkeley and the UFCW Western States Council, that food retail workers of color who belong to a union earned $2.15 more than non-union food retail workers of color. So you can go to the next slide. So with all of this data, we support as I said, our members' different models for organizing workplace by workplace, or organizing an entire sector in a geographic area or nationally across the country. We've also supported the Good Food Purchasing Program, which is a comprehensive institutional food procurement policy with standards around that include labor as well as welfare and nutrition. And we're now developing a concept to build on the Good Food Purchasing Program that we're calling Good Food Communities to further push public institutions to give food contracts to small producers of color, to food businesses that pay a living wage, to frontline workers, and that protect the environment for communities of color and frontline workers. And lastly, we have a new project I just want to share again that that we're looking through the lens of racial equity and the impacts on workers of color. So we're at early stages of developing a research project, a participatory research project to look at how technology, automation and surveillance are impacting farm workers. There's been a fair amount of research done on other sectors of the food chain, but not really on the level of agriculture. And so we will be working with farm workers to hold focus groups and create a survey that workers will use to survey other workers to ask each other, how is automation surveillance impacting them? What is their perception of how it will impact their jobs and their communities? But also, how do they see the potential of technology benefiting them to improve their jobs and their wages and working conditions? So, and then particularly on a sort of where we will be looking at how is automation and surveillance differentially impacting workers of color versus white workers? Is it, right? And if it is, how so? And then what are the organizing and policies that we want to advocate for to mitigate any negative impacts? So I think there's maybe one more slide with our social media. Yeah, right now, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Joann. That was a lot of really good information and gives some perspective. There's a lot of really good questions coming up, so keep the questions coming. When we finish with our next respondent, we'll move right into our Q&A. I'd like to introduce to you scholar, activist, and advocate Lindsey Lunsford. Inspired by her alma mater, Tuskegee University, is setting the tone for the upcoming generation of rural and urban agriculturalists. Currently working as a sustainable food systems resource specialist through Tuskegee University's Carver Integrative Sustainability Center, that's a mouthful. Ms. Lunsford works in the food justice and community sovereignty efforts. Her leadership focuses on educating underserved populations on self-sufficiency and healthy lifestyles, while encouraging the larger community to pursue a sustainable local economy. Welcome, Lindsey.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Renee. I appreciate that. I just want to start off by giving thanks to MSU Center for Regional Food Systems, as well as the Racial Equity in the Food System Working Group. I'm really excited to be able to come to, and also to the authors of this very, very useful and transformative publication. I'm really excited to get a chance to come today and kind of tell my story about the work that I do and how these metrics for racial equity strengthen the work that I do. So just getting into that briefly, the work that I do, I am a sustainable food system resource specialist at Tuskegee University's Cooperative Extension Program. I always love to shout out Tuskegee. Some call it the birthplace. I call it the birthplace of cooperative extension. We brought you the nation's first cooperative extension agent, Thomas Monroe Campbell, an African-American man from here in Macon County, living in Tuskegee. I think it's very important to center the role of quote-unquote minorities in the development and the proliferation of cooperative extension. And shout out to that new postdoc at MSU. She looks like a familiar face from Tuskegee. But I really want to talk about what we do at the Carver Integrative Sustainability Center, where we increase the economy and sustainability of small farmers and their surrounding cooperatives and communities. Our focus is the Black Belt South, which is an area with persistent poverty, an area where our food system was grown out of through chattel slavery and through the exploitation of the ancestors of the descendants that live here. And I want to talk about how these metrics have really advanced my work. So I work with Lincoln Policy to food systems, and in that work it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. One of those being working with the Journal for Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development, JAFSCD, and I work on a couple of different national equity groups. I'm also the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Fellow for E-Extension, and so my work takes a national focus at what is trending, what is happening with DEI, and especially with race in the food system. And so one of the ways that we use these metrics is with the equity group for the journal, or JAFSCD, as we set to advance our aims and look at how we want to move as a journal and as a group. We wanted to ground our aims in actual metrics. And so we go and I use this tool to actually look at the aims that we have and solidify them with metrics. So making sure that the aims that we have as a visioning body and as an organization are grounded in these metrics. And I wanted to highlight a quote from the actual publication itself, which says, "The ways in which racial injustice is made manifest through our food system are sometimes quite clear and other times murky at best." I really like that because you don't always understand how these metrics, how this manifests in people's life. And data is a powerful tool that can either illuminate or obstruct the reality of injustice. Disaggregating data by race can shed light on systematic oppression. And so why these metrics were so profound for me is because of the stories that they told, and that the ability for people to be like, hey, wait, that's happening to me. I didn't even know I could measure that. I didn't know this mistreatment I felt at a restaurant was data. I didn't know it was powerful. And so I'd like to move to the next slide, please. I chose to focus on food access as the portion of the document that that comes across a lot in my work. Although I work with different linkages throughout the food system, I felt like food access is a very important place to start. As we all know, the World Health Organization recognizes food access as one of the top 10 determinants for health. And so these 5 metrics really stood out to me, and they really held a story. And so one of the 2 that I just wanted to highlight briefly and bring to your attention, first being percent of people who dine out that report to having been discriminated against in the restaurant in the prior month. So this measures the discrimination in the restaurant industry towards patrons, and even so much as calling a 2001 sample of quote unquote dining while Black. And I just thought this was profound because people wouldn't think that in this day and age, 2019, people are still walking into a local Denny's or Waffle House and being made to feel extremely uncomfortable because of their skin color. So when I saw that as a metric, I was like, wow. number one. And then I had to check myself and be like, yeah, I mean, this is like, yeah, that's the reality. This is what we're living. This is what we're working with. 2024 and 26 all pertain to the quality and the presence of the supermarket, and how one supermarket in one community could have a completely different shopper experience for a low-income community of color. How you could have two Winn-Dixies, but they're completely different in one community compared to another. And this is something I've witnessed myself. I've heard people talk about and categorize. And so to actually bring this element of food access forward and just look at the different ways these grocery stores, from the reduction in time, how African-American groups are some of the largest groups to have consistent grocery store closures and then no new grocery stores being open. I thought that these were very important to highlight. And the last one, number 34, the percentage of food system education projects that use a racial equity curricula use a racial equity lens in their curriculum. I thought this was very profound because you'll see a lot of grants, you'll see a lot of organizations nationally that go into low-income communities and work with kids, work with children on food system curriculum. But how damaging are these programs if they're not exploring using a racial equity lens, and if they're not showing children how race has impacted and created the situation that causes these organizations to be there in the first place. And I was actually, after seeing this metric, able to reach out to some programs that I know of nationally that do use a racial equity lens in their curriculum and show them like, hey, this is why you guys are so powerful. Other organizations aren't doing this. So you need to put that feather in your cap and be very proud of it. So these are just the metrics that I found to be just most prolific and also astonishing, that we have to measure these things in our society today. So I thank you for your time, and I'll answer any questions as needed.
Yeah. For that. This has really kind of set us up for the questions and answers. There's a lot of really good content in this report. Some of the questions early on when you talked about the amount that people earn, so there's a question about whether that's hourly or how are we really measuring the amount of time that people are working and getting a sense of the wage. And we can tie that to another question, as well as why are food workers the least paid? Why are they the least paid when we look at, does it really make a difference in whether they're in a food chain or if they're in a restaurant or a grocery store? Or are they farmers? So
this is for Kathryn?
Yeah,
I
think this was early about the metrics. So I think these would be directed for you, Kathryn.
Yeah, well, I can answer the first part at least. In terms of how income differences are measured, specifically what unit you're using, that's one reason why I'm saying that this is not exhaustive and will never be exhaustive, and we're not trying to make it exhaustive because you could probably pick any unit. Mm-hmm. And actually, Sarah, my co-author, will remember we went back and forth a few different times, like, hey, these 5 metrics are essentially saying the same thing. They're all pointing out differences in income in some way, but just using different units, whether it's hourly rate or annual rate or monthly rate. So we did do some streamlining there. So the short answer is it doesn't totally matter. You'll get to a similar, probably similar finding regardless of the unit of measure that you're choosing. But what we have as the first couple in that income and benefits section, the first one, ratio of median annual wages, and then gap in median hourly wages. So at least 2 different ways to look at that, annual versus median hourly. And then in terms of why are food chain workers some of the least paid, I would defer to Joann on that. I think, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Joann, but I think it's probably related just to the dominance of the industry. There's so many food chain workers needed to feed so many people every day, and that creates a downward pressure on income.
As I mentioned, believe that part of it is related to the historical legacy of slavery and structural racism in the food system. And so the work that food workers do all throughout the supply chain, from farm workers, food processing, distribution, retail, restaurants, it's not valued. It's considered unskilled work and therefore not worth being paid higher wages, even though really so many of these jobs, it really does require skill. You need to know when it's the right time to pick, the tomato off the vine, or, pick it too soon. It's not going to make it to the store if you pick it too late, or, what I mean. And also we have seen, just in general, as throughout all industries, the rate of unionization has decreased as corporations and employers fight their employees, fight the workers from trying to unionize or get rid of a union that is in place. And so that we know that impacts wages as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's an additional question for you, Joann. Is there a regional or a state-by-state breakdown for the racial and gender wage disparity?
Right, yeah. So we haven't done that, but with the data available, I believe it is possible to do that, yeah.
Okay, all right, it is possible. Here's another question for you. So to the same point about the wage disparities, does racial gender wage disparity, does that account for differences in education? Or how does education play into that?
So we haven't looked at that.
Okay.
Who has advanced degrees or not is also related to structural racism. Who has access to education, the ability to pay for it, the difference in the quality of K through 12 education based on your race and socioeconomic, status.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see in certain communities where we have educational crisis, and a lot of that's related to race as well. So how does that end up feeding, into this? That might be something, as we get into this more, to take a look at it. We have another question here about our undocumented workers represented in the research related to the wages, and how are the undocumented workers really addressed in this plan around this good food community infrastructure. So is that a question for you, Kathryn?
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit, and Joann, I'm sure you can elaborate, but my understanding would be that some of these food chain worker metrics would capture some of the undocumented, and that was not always a question that was asked, but I'm sure they would be included in some of those, some of the data that was captured for food chain workers and farm workers specifically. But given the nature of that population, it's a harder population to reach and to document in terms of just understanding their situation.
Okay, thank you for that.
So in our first report, the Handset Feed Us, because we had workers surveying other workers, we did ask workers if they were comfortable responding to the question whether they were documented or undocumented. And so in that report, we also have a metric around wages for undocumented workers versus documented workers. And because they trusted other workers who were asking them questions. Many undocumented workers are working. Sometimes their employers don't know. So I would think that in the American Community Survey data, undocumented workers are included. In the second part of Paula's question, so Good Food Communities covers all workers. Anyone who works, it's a basic human right to be paid. Undocumented workers can be members of a union and organize to have a union contract. And also part of Good Food Communities is to support more people of color or worker of color owned co-ops. And that's one way for especially undocumented workers to have their own business by collectively owning it together as workers.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got a question for Lindsey. there's interest in knowing how did you become a sustainable food systems resource specialist. So here we are talking about race and representation in this work. Share a little bit about how you came to this role.
Yeah, definitely. It was kind of like an introspective question for me. I was trying not to go too deep. When I read that, I was like, well, how did I get here? I would like to say I was called to this work, but I'm sure that's not helpful for anyone trying to like strategically follow any steps. Definitely starting out with starting out in the food movement from a grassroots or soil level, working in community gardens, working as an organizer, and then seeing the need for the work at a policy level, and then getting involved in a program here at Tuskegee University. And I believe the position it was made for me. I was made for it. We kind of found each other. But once I found out that there was something as a food system, and then that there was work in food systems, I found out that there's a lot of food system specialists out there. It's just that they're usually all unicorns wherever they are. They're usually the only one or one of few at their universities. But there's an awesome program run through the Wallace Center, which is the Food System Leadership Network, FSLN. And they're great to connect to if you want to learn more about food systems work and how you actually do the work of it. I would definitely reach out to them. I believe Susan Schimpf organizes that initiative through the Wallace Center, and I can post a link. But and just talking to other people that do that work, and also centers. Usually, food system specialists work out of a center, so. Looking at different food system centers out there and seeing what positions they have available. And also just really identifying the community that you want to serve and where you want to do your work is important. And then the role that you need to fulfill to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very helpful. I'd like to pose this question to all of our, both of our presenters and our respondents. So as folks are looking at doing their work and using this lens and racial equity initiatives, this is a where do you start question. Would it be good to start with metrics that kind of resonate and kind of work backwards and go deeper? So if you were going to give some insight to those of us who want to take this tool and all that it is and bring it to our work, what's a good way to get started? And I would invite each of the speakers to answer that. So if I could ask Sarah first to weigh in and then work our way backwards.
Well, first of all, I'm so happy to be on the line with all of you, and it's just been so great to hear about how metrics kind of go to work in real life from Joann and Lindsey, and thank you for all your questions. I was just answering a similar question on the Q&A, and I'm going to give a similar response. I think that knowing where to begin really should depend on who you're trying to impact. I would say that meaningful feedback and participation from the folks for whom you're working, or if that's you, the group that you're working with, should really determine sort of where to start in this work. What is the priority in your community? What do people want to see impact on? What would they like to see measured? And sort of take it from there. So even if that's, not the most formal scan in the world, just having those conversations sort of with your constituents is where I would begin.
All right, great. Joann, would you weigh in?
I would add that to also think about what's the purpose of your research or your report, right? So, and like, do you want to use it to advocate for some kind of policy or change in an institution or in a city or something like that? And so knowing that, like, what are you going to use the data for, then that would also help inform you what metrics to look at.
Okay. All right. Great. Kathryn.
Sure. Yeah, this is actually exactly the next step for where we're at with the Shared Measurement Advisory Committee. So we've started to, look at the range of potential metrics, and now we need to decide how to decide on which metrics we're interested in. So we've been exploring different frameworks to do that. And one piece of the results-based accountability framework that we've been looking at that I liked is looking at communication power of the metric. And I think that's essentially what our other speakers have said, but it's the idea of think about who the people that you're trying to talk to will care about. What's the communication value of this metric, and is it something that will resonate with the community members or the policymakers or whoever it is that you want to be able to discuss this issue with. So I think that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, it's going to really be contextualized around what it is that you want to do. And then last but not least, who did I miss? Lindsey.
Yes. I would agree with a lot of the statements that I've heard before, that it really just depends on why you're looking to do this work. And also just keeping into the consideration of the personal, like a lot of the metrics that I focused on were things that I've experienced myself, that I've known that people have experienced. So it made sense just even in my life. I actually saw that work. And so that's why I thought that the publication was very helpful, because from a quantitative, because you experience these things in qualitatively, like throughout life, but to have a quantitative measurement of the things that you experience on a daily basis, or not even, or that you might experience on a regular basis, it really gives it that scholastic validation and support to be like, yeah, I did experience that in my life, and now I see that's I'm not alone in that there's a national trends and data of similar experiences. So it links your experience to the shared experience of systematic, issues, and you're better able to fight once you understand that you're not in an isolated incident, but you're like you're one data point amongst many.
Right. Thank you for that. We've got a number of questions asking about how do we find good examples of curriculum where you have this lens, for racial equity, and being able to distinguish whether the curriculum is really good or not so, good. Any insights? One of you could share experience and how it's showing up in our classrooms and how this lens is playing out, in the curriculum for our younger people, because obviously we're growing the next generation, right? What is that looking like in terms of your experience? Lindsey, do you do some work with education and curriculum, right?
Well, I think a lot of this is being spurred from the question from the metric number 30, looking at the number of, number 34, the percentage of food system education projects that use racial equity lens in their curriculum. So I think that this question is being sparked from a lot of those, and I've tried to answer as much as I can in the boxes, giving people some references of some projects that I knew about that do this work. But I would definitely recommend people look up Soul Fire Farm, based in the East Coast. They have a lot of different trainings and programs looking at how you integrate racial equity in farm work and in working with youth specifically. So they're a model that I would recommend to people, but they're not alone. There are a lot of others. And why I wanted to highlight this is my hunch would be that the programs that are incorporating this racial equity lens are doing this very naturally through the leadership and through their program design, and might not even be aware of the need to document what they're doing as novel. So that's one thing why I wanted to bring that up. And that's why I recommended this, because I knew of Lawrence Community Gardens in Indianapolis, Indiana, that I believe was centering racial equity in their work. And I was like, hey, do you know, like, you're kind of rare doing that. So let's better record that.
That's excellent. And you make a really good point there, because a lot of times people are doing really great work, but getting it documented and visible to others, helps to lift up exactly what's happening and makes it more tangible. So this is going to be the last question. And I want to remind everyone that We do follow up on the questions afterwards. If we don't get to all of the questions, those of us as a part of the steering committee will address as many of those as we can. We'll invite you to Rich will tell us a little bit about how to connect with us afterwards if you haven't already done that. So this last question I thought was really key, is asking how are we these metrics connecting to this theory of change around creating racial equity in the food system. So how do we really put it all together in a way that we know we're pointing toward something that's going to create an actual change? Because, you know, sometimes we try a lot of things, but the whole putting it in a theory of change. So Kathryn's nodding at me, so I think she might have some thoughts about what that looks like.
A great question. And it relates to why I emphasize that the context of how we're using this document in Michigan, because I do think that is really important to connect metrics to a theory of change, to connect them to a strategy of how you're approaching your work. You don't want to just dump data just for the sake of data, and you don't want to put yourself in the position of striving towards goals that you can't meet or reach, right? So I think that's the other, it also relates to that question of where to start. So what your constituents care about, what your partners, stakeholders care about, and also where you can affect change and what you have the ability to work on and dive into and see some progress towards. And that's where I do really see the value of putting it together in a theory of change and looking at your capacity as an organization, as a community of organizations in driving change around that area.
I think that's very helpful, because a lot of times we get a lot of really great information and it's a lot of data, and we think, oh my God, we got to address all of this. Really, it's all about the part that you're dealing with, the people that you're working with, your capacity to affect change, and using the tool to help inform your work going forward. So I want to thank our presenters and our respondents for their information and what they've shared with us. Obviously, this topic has a lot of depth and breadth to it, so this can't be the end of it, so stay tuned. At this point, I'd like to turn it back to Rich, and he's going to share a little more with you about our organization and how to access the resources.
Yeah, thanks very much, Renee, and thanks to Kathryn and to all the other speakers, Joann and Lindsey, and for Sarah for their comments here. It's been a really good webinar, and we've had a lot of questions. So again, this is co-sponsored by the Racial Equity in the Food System Workgroup, which is a national group with some funding from the Kellogg Foundation focused on trying to better use a racial equity lens in all food and health work. And it's not limited to cooperative extension, although that is a key organization. Over a third of our participants are from other organizations, nonprofits, state, federal government, and just everyday citizens. There's a link there for the work group, and there's a lot of other resources, all our previous webinars and other resources like the one Kathryn and Sarah have co-written, and the annotated bibliography on structural racism can be found on this site. And Renee is going to close our webinar out, but before we do that, we have some thoughts, some teasers about our next Racial Equity in the Food System webinar, and Lucy Diekman out in California is going to share a few things. I know we don't have a date yet, Lucy, but we're working on it. Let's hear what you have to say.
Yes, thanks, Rich, and thanks to everyone for attending today's webinar and for all the great questions. I just wanted to let everyone know that our next Racial Equity in the Food System Working Group webinar will be on food sovereignty. And as Rich mentioned, we haven't finalized a date yet, but we're looking at dates in the early fall. So in the meantime, if you have questions about not racial equity, about food sovereignty or things you'd like us to include, please let us know and we'll do our best to incorporate that. And otherwise, stay tuned for more specific information, and we hope you'll be able to join us on that webinar as well.
All right, thanks, Lucy. So once again, we want to thank you, everyone who joined us today for this very important topic. You will receive an email, everyone who registered for our webinars.
And we
Receive.
we had over 900 registrants.
Yes, we did. We had over 900 registrants, and almost half of the folks, you know, showed up. Yeah. You know, at one point we were at over 400 people. So we know how important this is. And so we'll be sharing with you the recording as well as the slides, and you'll get the link to the resource itself. So you can take this right into your work. We invite you to stay connected to us as well through our listserv. So we use that to communicate with one another. Oftentimes we get as many questions as we did during the webinar showing up in conversations in our listserv. So if you haven't joined us yet, we encourage you to do that as another way to stay involved in the conversation. So once again, thank you for joining us today. Peace and respect to you all, and we look forward to you joining us at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.